Somebody left an interesting comment on my video yesterday, my previous video concerning Amor Fati and love and that kind of thing, and sort of trying to extrapolate what that would actually mean and what the results of Amor Fati would be, I guess, upon the ego. And, you know, would that result in ego death? If you're radically open to reality, if you're radically open to your fate, and you've somehow managed to love every aspect of your fate, or love your fate as a whole, would that result in something that we would describe as ego death? Now that's interesting, because it's sort of, when you mention the ego, you're mentioning a part of yourself, perhaps not all of yourself, because your ego implies a subject-object relationship. If it's my ego and not somebody else's ego, that implies that there is something different, or something fundamentally other than me, that when I speak about the ego, or at least it's part of me, it's not all of me, or something like this. There is some sort of definition of ego-ness that is something that is either in addition to or part of what I am. In other words, I am more than the ego. Because even if you have the concept of ego death, what exactly happens? That's why when you start talking about the idea of the I, well, is there an I? Well, that's a very vague question, because there's so many ways you can judge that. If a being or a person has undergone what we would call ego death, something is still there, but the ego is gone. Well, the ego is the I, right? Because the ego is that which makes me, me, and not, Albert Einstein or Forrest Gump, whatever. It's my own individual share of consciousness in general, or my own individual perception or point of view of consciousness. If you erase the ego, what's left? And the way the word ego gets tossed around a lot, that person has a big ego, or that person's ego is strong, it's taken over, and all this implies that there's something else there besides the ego. Now, okay, let's sort of say that Amor Fati is sort of something that may originate in the ego, because I have chosen to do this, to love my fate. My fate is not somebody else's fate. My fate is only the one that I have chosen to live with, or not I have chosen, but the one that I am living with. I've got no bloody choice but to live with it. But I can like it or lump it. I can love it or I can hate it. That is an option I do have. Amor Fati would say that you avail yourself of the option of loving your ego, loving your fate. Now, when you've decided to love your fate, are you engaging your ego? You may be. But I would put it this way. I, slip of the tongue a second ago, I said your ego and your fate are the same thing. They may be. And the idea of your fate being that which you can't really control, that which is sort of just part and parcel of your experience of reality, is your fate, which, there is no escaping. One could also say that that's your ego, right? How can I escape my ego? Well, how do you deal with your ego? Well, I went to Catholic school, and the way that they teach you how to deal with your ego is to attack it, try and kill it, decide that it's an evil thing, and you have to destroy it, because it's bad. It results in selfishness, and we know just what a horrible thing selfishness is. You selfish son of a bitch. That's essentially what that's the Catholic guilt trip that they put on you when you're when they're teaching you right from wrong, as they say. You bludgeon it. Well, the thing is, and I know I'm straying into psychology here, but when you attack the ego, when you just decide to kill the ego instead of letting it die, I guess in the case of ego death, again, there's two ways you can sort of deal with your ego if you seek to overcome it in some way. You can attack it and try and kill it, or you can try to transcend it and try and sort of move beyond it, try and give it what it wants, the better to sort of move beyond it. But ego in our society, again, because of probably our Judeo-Christian background, we sort of think that ego is a bad thing, that having an ego is a vice. An ego in and of itself is something that we shouldn't have. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not sure that I agree with that your ego is bad. I would say that maybe your ego is something you might want to transcend, but it's not bad. I think that it's... I personally, I would like to transcend all kinds of things in my life. I'd like to transcend the fact that I have to have bowel movements regularly, but, that doesn't mean that going to the washroom is bad. I'd like to transcend the fact that I have to eat food to stay alive, but that doesn't mean that eating is bad. I'd like to transcend the limits of gravity if I could and float around all over the place. That doesn't make gravity bad. It just means that that's just something that is. Your ego simply is. But again, when you have the sort of, herd mentality, which is the result of modern utilitarian thinking, you get into the idea that the ego is not just something that, it's not just something inherent, it's something bad. So, attacking your ego, trying to transcend it or repress it, or I shouldn't say transcend it, because transcending your ego is not the same thing as trying to kill it, or to try and bludgeon it into submission or whatever with austerities or self-hatred or deliberately imposed or self-imposed anxiety, which, that's your typical religious neurosis, right? It's inner anxiety that's been deliberately put there, supposedly, for the subject's own good. Ego death, in that case, I would say, may be a mistake. I would call that egocide, where you decide you're just going to kill it. You're going to attack it, or you're going to bludgeon it into submission. Your ego will defend itself, and it'll go on the attack. You'll say, no, don't be so egotistical, but it'll sneak out in all kinds of ways that you don't realize. Your virtues become egotistical. It's the old trap about virtue in terms of guilt-based religion or a ethical system that's based on, say, moral imperatives as opposed to just virtue morals. You have an obligation to be a good person, to be to get rid of your vices. Therefore, you must attack and kill your vices. Well, your vices will reassert themselves in the form of subconscious desires. We all know that. The stereotypical repressed person that goes home and watches snuff porn or something like that. They've simply, instead of trying to deal with their ego in a healthy manner, they've attacked it. And the ego, of course, will reassert itself when the conscious mind is not deliberately trying to suppress it. So I would say that ego death is something that may result from Amor Fati, but it would be more like a case of ego transcendence, as opposed to you manage to kill your ego through Amor Fati. Your ego would just sort of, drift away of its own accord, because you haven't really deprived it of what it wants. You've simply given it what it wants and moved on, as it were. The way that the Hindus would describe it is, your ego is only your own personality, which is going to vanish at death anyway. But you have, in whatever way, identified yourself with that which isn't necessarily contingent upon your own existence on this, this very version of consciousness that we're living now. Now, I'm not saying that I believe in life after death or reincarnation or any of that. I'm not. I'm simply using that kind of example to illustrate the difference and how these things can be sort of, how consciousness and how the ego can be sort of differentiated, at least in terms of our ability to discuss them as things. If you have Amor Fati, I would assume, in an advanced and well-cultivated form of Amor Fati, and I rather suspect that Amor Fati takes a lifetime to cultivate. It's not just something you can decide to do. I would assume that at the moment of death, you would sort of say, yes, I have somehow transcended my ego, simply because I don't really, if there's nothing in me anymore but love, then I'm sort of attracted to everything. I'm not repelled from anything. There's nothing that I'm pushing away. That's the way Nietzsche described Amor Fati. He says, I want to be a yes-sayer, not a yes man, not just I agree with everything no matter how horrible. And being a yes-sayer is not an end in itself. But you just want to say, in terms of my fate, I love all of it. You're not saying, again, this is your fate that you're talking about. You're not talking about the overt actions here, or the overt events. Let's say that I live through an age in which something horrific happens. Let's say I'm a German and I'm living through the Holocaust or something like that, and I've decided to embrace Amor Fati. You're not so much embracing the fact that the Holocaust is happening. You're embracing the fact that you are fated to live in a time when the Holocaust is happening right in front of your face. That's what you are loving. You're not loving the Holocaust. You're loving the fact that you are existing at a time when that is happening. Again, it's just kind of I won't say a mind game that you're playing, but it is just sort of a mental exercise. It's a psychological thing. You're just sort of saying, what is my relationship to my own fate? And again, that's almost like saying, what's my relationship to my ego? You're sort of saying that, well, there are differences here between me and my ego, a subject-object relationship, or I don't know, who knows what that would be. You're just talking about different parts of your own being, or your own self, or whatever. So I would say that no, I don't think that an aim of Amor Fati would be ego death. But I would say that ego death could be, and almost certainly is, a result of Amor Fati. But you're not sort of killing your ego. You're transcending it and allowing it to die peacefully in its sleep, type thing. It was a good question that was asked, and he said, look, you don't have to answer this because I know it's a weird question. But yeah, it is a weird question, but it's one of those ones that makes you think. And I love that. I love it when somebody says something, somebody throws a curve at me, especially when it's something that has a lot to do with something that I'm thinking about a lot, existential issues. So your ego may be simply a part of being human. Humans have egos. It does seem to go with the territory, right? So should I hate the fact that I have an ego? Why? I should hate what I am? Ridiculous. Or should I see the ego as something that I should at least try and control? And again, or let's say if I am going to control my ego, how am I going to go about that? Am I going to do it forcefully? Or am I going to do it sort of diplomatically, as it were, or am I going to give it what it wants, as I say, and transcend it? It's the difference between ego-cide and simply moving beyond your ego. I would say that it's a subtle difference, but it's a very important one. Again, just because your ego has sort of a life of its own, if you try and kill it, you end up either with neurosis, which, again, the Catholic guilt complex is the one where you're taught to hate yourself. And I suppose that guilt in many ways is some sort of hatred of your ego, or even self-hatred is miso-egoism, I guess you'd call it, or horo-ego, or whatever, where you hate your own ego. That's not the same thing as trying to move beyond your ego. You understand that you have these limitations. I mentioned the limitations that are inherent in being human. I occupy a body. I have a limited lifespan. I have to do all kinds of things to feed this body, and I have all these emotional needs and physical needs and everything that have to be met. Okay, that's part of what I am, but it doesn't mean that that is all of what I am. I don't want to just destroy my body through horrible austerities or through deliberate neglect of my body in order to transcend it. Now, the Jains do say that, yes, you have to do that. You have to just sort of refuse to accept the reality of phenomenality. You have to refuse to accept what the Hindus, again, call prakriti. You have to refuse to accept the gross physical universe. And basically kill your ego and let your body die, and only then will you be released into blissful non-existence, I suppose. I don't subscribe to that point of view. I understand the attraction of asceticism and everything, and I can see how there's a lot of pleasure involved in it, ironically. But I don't think that it's necessary for us to declare war upon ourselves. That what we are is something that has to be forcibly overcome with superhuman willpower. I suppose we could, but I don't think that it's necessary, or that's the only way. In fact, I've seen plenty of people who have attempted to deal with overstrong egos, overmighty egos, and the result of their attempts to crush these egos have been disastrous. No, thank you. That's not the way I want to go. I'd rather tame my ego or calm it down or approach it the way you're approaching a skittish horse. Just give your ego what it wants, what it needs, and maybe it'll eventually calm down to the point where you can just move beyond it. As I say, in many ways it's a subtle distinction, but an important one. How do we deal with the fact that we are individuals? And how do we overcome I don't know what you'd call it, the complications that result therefrom? I'm a person, I mention this a lot, I've got a powerful streak of arrogance in my character. I know this. Egotistical as well. I know this. But I'm not going to try and deal with it by trying to smash myself down a peg. That's not going to get me anywhere. I'm just attacking something that's already extremely strong, and it may be stronger than me. How strong is your own ego? How do you know how strong your ego is? Again, you may not even be able to kill your own ego if you decide to declare war on it. But, you just end up spending your entire life in a state of internal conflict. No, thank you. Again, that just reminds me too much of religion and deliberately inculcated inner conflict and guilt. You want to go beyond the ego, I think there's only the hard way to do it, and that's to sort of deal with the fact that it's there and accept it. I think at the age of 50, I think I'm always going to have an ego that's going to operate like this. It'd be nice if it wasn't like this, if I wasn't such an arrogant person. But I think it seems to be pretty built in, at least in terms of the whole canvas of what I am, that the ego is in there. And it's, it doesn't seem to respond to the bludgeoning that a lot of people advocate in terms of trying to deal with an ego. So what else am I going to do? If I'm not going to kill it, if I'm not even going to try and kill it anymore, now what? Well, I don't want to join it because that just makes me, a big, I don't want to succumb to my ego, as it were, because then it just means that me taking everything, being as greedy as is humanly possible, is actually a good thing for me, which I don't believe either. I think that greed is a vice. And greed for everything, greed for not just material possessions, but greed for friendship, greed for love, greed for power, greed for all kinds of things. I think that that's a vice. And I don't, that's what happens when you succumb to your ego. You hand it the reins, as it were, in your own life. No, I don't want that either. So what I would say is, if you give the ego what it wants, but don't let it control you, that might be the ideal scenario in terms of our ability to live as agents, as humans. Again, transcending something, moving beyond it, using it as a foundation for something later on down the road, or a foundation for a larger structure, a larger edifice of your life. I mentioned a lot the Indian idea of the three gunas. You have the lower, the middle, and the higher guna, and you have to sort of transcend all of them. The lower guna is the one that brings you lethargy and depression, and the second one is what brings you mania and action and heat, and the higher guna is the one that is sort of balanced and more together and integrated, but ultimately you want to get beyond all of them. But it's an upward process. You don't destroy the lower guna, you simply deal with it in such a way as to be able to move on to the next one, and then you sort of deal with that one in such a way as to be able to move on to the next one. You're building, as it were, sort of a structure underneath you, or you're moving up a ladder, and you can't just destroy the rungs underneath you, because they're holding up the ladder. And I would say that the ego seems to work that way. The ego seems to be part of the structure on which the rest of our endeavors, I guess, will ultimately depend. Because ultimately, as long as we're existing in this very plane of existence that we're in now, we're doing so as individuals. Ego. I'm stuck with that, regardless of what I want to do. So there's got to be a better way than internal conflict to deal with that, to deal with it and move beyond it, or to transcend it, or to move, or to sort of build upon it, I suppose. This is kind of a esoteric or cryptic sort of subject to be talking about. And again, as I say, you're straying into psychology here, but I'm not one of these people that draws a clear line between philosophy and psychology. In fact, I don't really draw many clear lines between anything. I think everything bleeds into everything else, ultimately. But I hope, Mr. Perez, that this dealt with the question more satisfactorily than the comment that I left on the video.